What would you do if you found an ancient martial art manual promising superhuman abilities hidden in your dead grandfather's attic, and it actually worked? Welcome back to Tales of Wonder. If you enjoy stories that blur the line between reality and legend, stories that make you question what's truly possible, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a tale that'll leave you speechless. Now let's begin today's story. Mark Chun had never been the athletic type. At 28, he was a software engineer with the posture of a question mark, the upper body strength of a librarian, and a gym membership that existed purely as a monthly donation to his own guilt. His idea of physical exertion was carrying two monitors up a flight of stairs, and even that left him winded enough to question his life choices. So, when his mother called him that humid Saturday morning in July, asking him to clean out his late grandfather's attic in preparation for selling the old family house, Mark approached the task with all the enthusiasm of someone being asked to file taxes by hand. His grandfather, Chen Wei, had passed away 6 months earlier at the impressive age of 94, taking with him a lifetime of stories that Mark had always been too busy, too distracted, or too absorbed in his phone to properly listen to. The house sat on the outskirts of Portland, a modest two-story structure that smelled perpetually of camphor and old wood. Mark arrived with cleaning supplies, garbage bags, and a vague sense of familial obligation. The attic was exactly what he'd expected, an archaeological dig site of forgotten decades. Boxes of yellowed photographs, moth-eaten clothes that probably qualified as vintage now, broken furniture that someone had optimistically saved for fixing someday, and enough dust to create a respiratory hazard. He spent the first 2 hours sorting through the obvious garbage, working up a sweat that reminded him why he avoided manual labor. His grandfather had been a quiet man, a first-generation immigrant who'd worked as a tailor and rarely spoke about his life before America. The family knew he'd grown up somewhere in rural China, that he'd left during the tumultuous years before the Cultural Revolution, but the details had always been murky, lost in translation and generational disinterest. Mark was about to call a day when his foot caught on a loose floorboard near the far corner of the attic. He stumbled, catching himself on a beam, and heard the distinct sound of wood separating from wood. When he looked down, the floorboard had shifted, revealing a gap underneath. Curiosity momentarily overpowered his exhaustion. He knelt down, prying the board up completely, and discovered a small compartment beneath. Inside was a cloth-wrapped bundle, approximately the size of a textbook, bound with cord that had probably been red once, but had faded to a dusty pink. Mark lifted it carefully. The cloth was silk, he realized, though aged and fragile. When he unwrapped it, his breath caught. It was a book, or more accurately, a hand-bound manuscript. The cover was made of some kind of thin wood or heavy paper, with characters brushed in fading ink. Mark's Chinese reading skills were embarrassingly basic, limited mostly to menu items and the occasional text from his mother, but he could make out enough to send a thrill down his spine. The title, as far as he could decipher, was something like Qinggong Methods or Light Body Techniques. And as he carefully opened the brittle pages, his eyes widened. Inside were detailed illustrations of human figures in various poses, standing on vertical surfaces, leaping impossible distances, balancing on what appeared to be bamboo poles or tree branches. The text was dense, written in traditional characters that swam before his eyes, but the drawings were unmistakable. This was a martial arts manual. More specifically, it appeared to be a guide to the kind of physics-defying movement he'd seen in countless Wuxia films, the wirework-enhanced, gravity-optional acrobatics that made movies like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon so mesmerizing. Mark sat back on his heels, the manual resting in his lap. His first thought was that this had to be some kind of fantasy document, the medieval Chinese equivalent of a Dungeons & Dragons handbook. His second thought was wondering why his grandfather had hidden it under the floorboards like it was contraband. He spent the next hour carefully photographing each page with his phone, partly for preservation and partly because he was genuinely fascinated. The illustrations were beautiful, rendered with a precise hand that suggested the artist had real skill. Some pages showed breathing techniques, others detailed foot positioning and weight distribution. There were diagrams of what appeared to be specific training exercises, standing meditation poses, leg strengthening routines, balance drills. One section in particular caught his attention. It showed a progression of exercises, starting with walking on gradually inclining surfaces, then demonstrated a technique that involved something the rough translation app on his phone called adhesion stepping, or possibly gecko walking. The illustrations showed feet positioned at specific angles against vertical surfaces, with notes about energy flow and muscle engagement. It was utterly ridiculous. It was also utterly compelling. Mark carefully rewrapped the manual and brought it downstairs, along with a box of his grandfather's old photographs. That evening, back in his apartment, he found himself obsessively going through the photos, seeing his grandfather with new eyes. There was Chun Wei as a young man, thin and serious, in a formal photograph from the 1950s. There he was again in the 1970s, outside his tailor shop, still thin, still serious. And there, Mark paused, was a photo he'd never noticed before, tucked in the back of the stack. It showed his grandfather, probably in his 40s, at some kind of outdoor gathering. He was mid-movement, captured in a pose that seemed impossible, balanced on one foot atop a narrow post, his other leg extended, his body perfectly horizontal. It could have been a trick of perspective, but something about the photo's casual quality, the way other people in the background weren't even paying attention, suggested this was just something his grandfather could do. Mark stared at the photo for a long time. Then he looked at the manual, still wrapped on his coffee table. Then he did something he'd never done before in his adult life. He cleared space in his living room and decided to try some exercises. The manual's opening section was surprisingly practical. It didn't start with walking on walls or leaping over buildings. It started with standing meditation, with breathing exercises, with basic balance drills that seemed almost boring in their simplicity. Stand on one foot for 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. Focus on your breath. Feel the connection between your foot and the ground. Mark, who couldn't remember the last time he'd stood on one foot for more than 30 seconds, found it excruciating. His standing leg shook. His back cramped. He fell over repeatedly, catching himself on his couch with all the grace of a collapsing scarecrow. But something about the challenge hooked him. Maybe it was the mystery of his grandfather's hidden past. Maybe it was the sheer audacity of a manual claiming to teach impossible skills. Or maybe it was just that Mark, whose job involved sitting in front of screens for 12 hours a day, was desperately craving something physical, something tangible, something that existed outside the digital realm. He started practicing every evening. 20 minutes at first, then 30, then an hour. The standing meditation became easier. His legs stopped shaking as much. He moved on to the next exercises, slow, controlled lunges that the manual claimed would build rooted strength, balance drills on increasingly narrow surfaces, breathing techniques that were supposed to improve qi circulation, but mostly just made him lightheaded if he did them wrong. His co-workers started commenting on changes. "Mark, did you lose weight?" He hadn't, but his posture had improved. "You seem taller." He wasn't, but he stood differently now, with his weight more evenly distributed. His mother called one Sunday and said he sounded more energetic. He felt it too, a kind of vitality he hadn't experienced since childhood, before screens and desk jobs had compressed his existence into a seated position. 3 months into this bizarre training regimen, Mark attempted something that would have seemed insane to his former self. The manual had a section on incline progression, walking on steeper and steeper surfaces to build the specific muscle memory and strength needed for vertical movement. He started in a parking garage near his apartment, finding a section where the floor gradually ramped up. Following the manual's instructions about foot positioning and weight transfer, he walked back and forth on increasingly steep sections, focusing on maintaining balance and control. It felt ridiculous. He was a grown man, practicing walking like it was a skill he'd forgotten. But the manual insisted this was essential, that before you could transcend normal movement, you had to perfect normal movement, had to understand it so completely that your body could begin to extrapolate beyond it. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday evening, 4 months after finding the manual. Mark had set up a test in his apartment building's parking garage, a concrete support pillar with a slight rough texture. Following the manual's technique exactly, he approached at the angle specified, positioned his foot with the precise toe-out position illustrated, engaged his core the way the breathing exercises had taught him, and pushed. For approximately 2 seconds, his foot stuck to the vertical surface. His body weight shifted. He took another step and fell on his ass immediately, his sneakers squeaking against the concrete as gravity reasserted its dominance. But for those 2 seconds, 2 impossible, physics-defying seconds, it had worked. Mark sat on the ground of that parking garage, breathing hard, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from the absolute disbelief of what he'd just experienced. It hadn't been graceful, it hadn't been sustained, but it had been real. He went home and studied the manual with renewed intensity. That night, he barely slept, his mind racing through the mechanics of what had just happened. The manual wasn't teaching magic, it was teaching techniques so specific, so refined, that it could exploit micro-friction, body positioning, and momentum in ways that seemed to defy physics, but actually just used physics differently. Over the next 3 months, Mark's progress accelerated. 2 steps became 3. 3 became 5. He learned to read the texture of surfaces, to judge which materials offered enough friction, and to use his momentum to maintain pressure against vertical planes. He trained in the parking garage late at night, when no one was around, a solitary figure walking incrementally higher up concrete pillars like the world's least impressive Spider-Man. His apartment became a testing ground. He could now walk 3 steps up his living room wall before gravity won. It wasn't the wirework, graceful movement of movies. It was jerky, required intense focus, and left him exhausted. But it was undeniably real. He was doing something that, 8 months ago, he would have sworn was purely fictional. Mark documented everything meticulously, partly from his engineer's instinct to track data, and partly because he still couldn't quite believe it himself. He took videos from multiple angles, measured his progress, noted which surfaces worked best. Rough concrete was ideal, smooth drywall was nearly impossible, and recorded how fatigue affected his ability. But he told no one. The manual's opening page, which he'd eventually had properly translated, contained a warning. These techniques are not for display or pride. They are tools of survival, developed in necessity, preserved through discretion. Those who perform for others invite disaster. Mark had initially dismissed this as mystical nonsense, but the more he progressed, the more he understood. What he was doing would seem impossible to observers. It would invite scrutiny, skepticism, and demands for explanation. It would turn him into a spectacle, a curiosity, a person defined by one unusual ability rather than a complete human being. His grandfather had hidden the manual under the floorboards. There was probably a reason. The practical application of his new skill came in the most mundane way possible. Mark's apartment building had a persistent raccoon problem. Clever bandits that had learned to climb the fire escape and raid the dumpsters. One evening, coming home late from work, he saw a particularly bold raccoon that had somehow gotten into the building's courtyard and couldn't find its way out, growing increasingly agitated as it scrambled against the smooth walls. Without thinking, Mark approached the situation the way the manual had taught him to approach everything, calmly, with precise positioning. He used his technique to walk up the corner where 2 walls met, providing just enough texture for purchase. At about 8 feet up, he reached the courtyard's upper ledge, pulled himself over, and created noise that scared the raccoon toward the open gate it had been too panicked to find. It was only when he dropped back down, landing in the controlled role the manual had taught for impact distribution, that he noticed someone watching. His neighbor from 3B, an elderly Korean woman named Mrs. Park, stood with her grocery bags, her expression impossible to read. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said in accented English, then walked into the building before Mark could respond. The comment haunted him. Had his grandfather demonstrated these abilities? Had people known? And if so, why had the manual been hidden? Why had no one ever mentioned it? Mark started researching his grandfather's history with renewed interest. He contacted distant relatives, combed through immigration records, and pieced together fragments of a story that had been deliberately obscured. Chun Wei hadn't just been a tailor who'd immigrated from China. He'd been a student at a martial arts school in Fujian province, trained in a style that was later suppressed during the Cultural Revolution as bourgeois and impractical. He'd left China not just for economic opportunity, but because practitioners of feudal superstitious practices were being targeted. The martial arts school had been destroyed. The other students had scattered or recanted or disappeared into the chaos of that era. His grandfather had carried the manual out as one of the last surviving records of techniques that had taken generations to develop and refine. And he'd hidden it, preserved it, kept it secret for over 50 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person. Mark felt the weight of that responsibility. This wasn't just an interesting hobby or a party trick. This was a piece of cultural heritage, a physical practice developed through centuries of refinement, preserved through tremendous sacrifice. He made a decision. He would continue training, continue mastering the techniques, but he would also document them properly. Not for social media fame or viral videos, but for preservation. He began creating detailed written descriptions in both English and Chinese, supplementing the original manual with modern biomechanical explanations, high-speed camera footage showing the precise movements, and force diagrams explaining the physics. He reached out to a professor at Portland State University who specialized in traditional Chinese martial arts, explaining carefully that he'd inherited a historical document. The professor, Dr. Wei Lin, was skeptical until Mark demonstrated a few basic techniques in her university office, balancing exercises that seemed simple but showcased control that took months to develop. Dr. Wei's skepticism transformed into intense academic interest. She explained that many traditional martial arts texts had been lost during the Cultural Revolution, that what Mark had was potentially a rare surviving example of authentic Qinggong methodology. Not the theatrical interpretation popularized by movies, but the actual training methods used by historical practitioners. You understand what you have is essentially impossible, she said, watching Mark demonstrate a balanced position from the manual. Not because the physics don't work, clearly they do, but because the level of body control required is so far beyond normal human experience that most people could train their entire lives and never achieve it. The manual has a progression, Mark explained. It builds a foundation systematically. I think that's the secret. It doesn't start with the impossible stuff. It starts with standing on one foot and really, truly perfecting that before moving forward. Dr. Wei arranged for Mark to give a private demonstration to a small group of martial arts historians and biomechanics researchers. In a university gymnasium with academic rigor and video documentation, Mark performed. Not the full wall walking. He wasn't confident enough yet for that level of display, but the foundational techniques. The balanced positions seemed to defy the center of gravity. The stepping patterns that allowed movement up inclined surfaces that should have been too steep. The controlled falls and impacts distributed force in ways that prevented injury. The researchers were astounded. One biomechanics professor kept repeating, "This shouldn't be possible, but clearly it is," while frantically taking notes. A martial arts historian from Beijing examined the manual with tears in her eyes, explaining that she'd heard references to this particular school, but had thought all records were destroyed. Mark found himself at the center of something much bigger than he'd anticipated. Academic papers were written. The manual was carefully preserved and digitized. Museums expressed interest. But Mark kept the demonstrations private, limited to academic contexts, honoring the manual's warning about discretion. His life had transformed in ways he never expected. The software engineer who'd never exercised now trained daily, not out of obligation, but genuine passion. His body had changed. Lean muscle replacing sedentary softness, posture transformed, movements economical and precise. But more than that, his connection to his grandfather, to his heritage, to a piece of history he'd almost thrown away as attic garbage, had given him something he hadn't known he was missing. One evening, practicing alone in the parking garage that had become his training ground, Mark successfully walked 12 steps up a vertical pillar before his focus wavered and he had to dismount. 12 steps. A year ago, that would have seemed like magic. Now, it was just practice paying off. He thought about his grandfather, hiding this manual for 5 decades, preserving it without knowing if anyone would ever discover it, care about it, or use it. He thought about all the conversations they could have had, the training his grandfather could have provided, if only Mark had been paying attention instead of staring at screens. But maybe this was better. Maybe discovering it himself, earning every increment of progress through frustration and failure and persistent effort, had been the actual lesson. The manual didn't just teach physical techniques. It taught patience, discipline, respect for incremental progress, the value of preserving difficult knowledge even when the world didn't seem to want it. Mark's phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Wei, BBC documentary crew interested in filming. Your call, but huge opportunity for preservation. He considered it. The manual had warned against public display, but it had been written in a different time, when practitioners faced real persecution, when revealing these abilities could mean danger. Now, careful documentation could mean preservation. It could mean other descendants of lost martial arts schools might come forward with their own hidden manuals, their own preserved techniques. Mark typed back, let's talk about parameters. Private techniques stay private. Foundation methods only for filming. Grandfather's story must be told respectfully. Dr. Wei's response was immediate. Agreed. You've honored his legacy perfectly. Had he? Mark looked at the parking garage, at the scuff marks his shoes had left on the pillar from countless practice sessions, at the manual carefully stored in his backpack. His grandfather had spent 50 years keeping a secret. Mark had spent less than 1 year learning to understand why it had been worth keeping. He drove home thinking about legacy, about what we preserve and why, about the difference between the skills we develop for display and the skills we develop for ourselves. The wall walking was impressive, sure, but the real transformation had been internal. The discipline, the patience, the connection to history and heritage that couldn't be measured in vertical steps or documented in videos. 3 months later, Mark sat in a professional recording studio, being interviewed for what would become a surprisingly thoughtful documentary about lost martial arts. The producers had initially wanted sensational footage. Man defies gravity using ancient Chinese manual. But Mark, with Dr. Wei's support, had insisted on a different approach. The documentary focused on his grandfather's story, on the Cultural Revolution's destruction of traditional practices, on the importance of preserving intangible cultural heritage. Mark demonstrated some techniques, but carefully with academic context, with explanations of the physics and biomechanics, making it clear this wasn't magic or wire work, but the result of sophisticated training methodology developed over generations. Near the end of filming, the interviewer asked the question Mark had been expecting. Can you really walk on walls? Like in the movies? Mark smiled. The manual teaches techniques that allow for limited vertical movement under specific conditions with particular surfaces. It's not the same as movie wire work, but it's also not normal walking. My grandfather spent his life preserving this knowledge. I'm spending mine trying to understand it. Whether that counts as walking on walls depends on your definition. Can you show us? Some things, Mark said carefully, are meant to be practiced rather than performed. The manual's very first lesson is about discretion. I think that lesson might be more important than any physical technique. The interviewer looked disappointed, but nodded. The documentary aired 6 months later, balanced and thoughtful, and brought unexpected consequences. A woman in her 70s contacted Mark through Dr. Wei. Her father had also trained at the same Fujian school, had also smuggled out documents, different techniques, focused on herbal medicine and injury treatment rather than movement, but part of the same lineage. A man in Vancouver had his grandfather's training diary, meticulously documenting conditioning exercises. Another descendant in Singapore had photographs, actual images of practitioners from the 1940s performing demonstrations. They were all fragments of the same destroyed school, pieces of a puzzle that had seemed permanently scattered. Together, through careful collaboration and respect for their ancestors' caution, they began to reconstruct a more complete picture of what had been lost. Mark found himself part of a small community dedicated to preservation without exploitation. They met annually, shared documents carefully, trained together, and honored the discretion their grandparents had practiced out of necessity, which had become discretion practiced out of respect. He still practiced in the parking garage late at night. His record was now 18 steps up a vertical pillar before momentum failed. Not movie magical, but undeniably beyond normal human capacity. He could balance on surfaces that should be too narrow, fall from heights that should be dangerous, and land safely. Move with an economy of motion that made everyday activities effortless. But the real achievement, Mark often reflected, wasn't the physical skills. It was understanding why his grandfather had hidden the manual under those floorboards. Not because the techniques were dangerous, but because they were precious. Not because they needed to be secret, but because they needed to be protected from those who would reduce them to spectacle without understanding their context, their history, their meaning. On the first anniversary of finding the manual, Mark returned to his grandfather's old house, now sold to a new family. He stood outside, looking up at the attic window where he'd tripped over that loose floorboard, and felt a profound gratitude for that clumsiness, that accident, that moment of curiosity that had changed his life. His phone buzzed. His mother, asking if he'd found what he was looking for in the attic all those months ago. Mark smiled and typed back, "More than I ever expected. Wish I could thank him. But maybe he already had. Every time he practiced, every time he taught someone the proper breathing technique or the correct foot positioning, every time he chose preservation over performance, understanding over exhibition, respect over recognition. The manual sat in a climate-controlled preservation case now, properly cared for, digitally documented, studied by researchers. But Mark kept a careful handwritten copy for his own use, updating it with his notes, his observations, his own incremental additions to a living tradition that had survived through exactly this kind of careful, loving transmission. He drove home thinking about his grandfather walking into that tailor shop every day for decades, carrying the knowledge of impossible movement, the memory of destroyed schools, the weight of being one of the last practitioners of a centuries-old art. Pressing seams, hemming pants, keeping secrets, waiting. Mark wasn't sure what his grandfather had been waiting for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just waiting was the point. Preserving something valuable without knowing if it would ever matter again, without needing recognition or validation, simply because it was worth preserving. That evening, in his apartment, Mark stood on one foot in the meditation posture that had started everything. His standing leg was rock steady now, his breathing deep and controlled, his mind quiet. Somewhere beneath the floorboards of a house he no longer owned, his younger self was tripping over loose boards, finding wrapped bundles, beginning a journey that connected him to a grandfather he'd barely known and a heritage he'd barely understood. Outside his window, Portland stretched into evening, full of people walking normally, on normal surfaces, living normal lives. And that was fine. That was perfect, actually. The world didn't need everyone to walk on walls. The world needed people who understood that some things were worth preserving simply because they were remarkable, whether anyone ever saw them or not. Mark smiled, lowered his foot, and began his evening practice. 18 steps yesterday, maybe 19 tonight, or maybe 18 again. The number didn't really matter. The practice did. The preservation did. The connection to something larger than himself did. His grandfather would understand. Maybe in some way he'd known all along. If you discovered your ancestor had secretly preserved an ancient skill that seemed impossible, would you choose to master it in private or share it with the world? And what do you think that choice would say about you? If this story made you think about the secrets our ancestors carry and the legacies they leave behind, show some love by hitting that like button. Drop a comment below telling me what hidden skill you'd want to discover, or share a story about something surprising you've learned about your own family. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? There are so many more incredible tales waiting to be told right here on Tales of Wonder. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.